And of course, when we talk about dividend policy, we should include in that the idea of stock buybacks or repurchases as an alternative way for the firm to return cash to its equity holders. So I'm not interested, though, in this whole slideshow, because what I really want to focus on today in this Camtasia lecture is how to assess the policy, right? So we've talked about the theoretical pros and cons of dividends and why a firm should pay dividends or why they shouldn't pay dividends, and all those different theories about dividends in class. But here I just want to show you some mechanics of determining how much cash a firm can pay out. So we're kind of approaching these steps that are on this slide out of order. These two things, the step 1 and step 2, really don't have to be done in that order. So we're going to look at how much could the company have paid out during the period in question, and versus how much the company did actually pay out in dividends or repurchases. And then, of course, depending on whether they paid out more than they had, which is occasionally possible, right? You can't, that's not sustainable over the long term, but occasionally it's possible. Or if they are very regularly paying out less than they can, then the firm is building up a cash hoard, right? If they're paying out more than they can being defined by the cash flow for that year, then of course if they're paying out more than the cash flow from that year, it must come from the cash hoard, the cash balance on the balance sheet that the firm has. And they can do that occasionally, but not every year for a long period of time. On the other hand, if they're regularly paying out less than they can every year, then they're building up that cash hoard, that war chest, whatever you want to call it. And the question is, if they are building up a war chest, how happy are we as stockholders about this arrangement, right? Do we trust the management to do good things with this excess cash? And of course, by good things, unfortunately, I'm not talking about charity work, right? I'm talking about making wise investments that will earn more than the firm's cost of capital, right? So we're going to look at how much they could have paid out. That's called the free cash flow to equity. We're going to look at how much they did pay out. And then if they have excess cash, we're going to assess whether the firm has been making good investments and if the stock has been performing well. And then we will decide whether to recommend that the firm increase the dividend, decrease the dividend, initiate a dividend, whatever the firm's policy currently is, looking at possibly changing it. Okay, so I've just kind of described this in words, but here it is kind of pictorially what we're going to do. We're going to look at how much the firm paid out, and this is kind of a shortcut version of the formula we're going to use. But basically we're looking at all the cash flow for the year, right? All the cash that came in the form of net income and other cash, and all the cash that went out because of capital expenditures and investments in working capital, and then what's left over versus what they paid out in dividends and in repurchases. And if we look and we find that the free cash flow to equity is greater than the dividends, then that might suggest that the firm is paying out too little, right? They can afford to pay more, so then we have to see whether we actually want them to pay more, and that will be dependent on whether we trust the managers of the company to use the cash wisely, and we can look at past investment results to see whether we would trust them in the future, right? Of course, past performance doesn't always guarantee future results, but that's the information that we have. We don't know what they will do in the future, so we can compare return on equity to the firm's cost of equity, which you've already calculated for your firms. Of course, return on equity you did at the very beginning, and if you didn't, that's a very simple calculation that we'll go over again. And you have your cost of equity from your recent cost of capital estimation. And then we can also fairly quickly compute a simple return on invested capital and compare that to our cost of capital. So if our return on equity and our return on capital and our stock performance has been good, that suggests that our firm has been choosing projects wisely, and if there is excess cash, maybe we can trust them to do a good job with it. On the other hand, if we find that our cost of equity and our cost of capital is regularly exceeding what we're earning in return on equity and return on capital, and then and also if our stock is not performing well, then maybe we don't really want the firm to keep our cash because they seem to be doing a poor job of investing it. Right? And cash that sits around, tends to burn a hole in a manager's pocket, and then sometimes they do really bad things with it. Either they, buy perks for themselves, such as, new offices, a corporate jet, maybe something like that, or they engage in acquisitions that they have no business engaging in. On the other hand, if we go through this process up here and we find that our firm's free cash flow to equity is really less than the dividends and the repurchases they've been paying out regularly, well, that's a concern too. Certainly they can do it once in a while if they have some cash, a cash hoard that they're trying to reduce, or if they're recapitalizing the firm and they're bringing in debt and paying out dividends, that would tend to increase the debt ratio, and perhaps that's one strategy the firm is using to get up to their target debt ratio. But then the free cash flow to equity formula actually includes money that comes in through debt, so that might not be the issue there, right? So if they are continually paying out more in dividends than they're bringing in cash flows, then that's a concern too, right? So again, we're still going to look at their project results, and if we find that the firm has been earning well on their investments, then they should probably cut dividends and reinvest more of their cash flow. If they've been doing poorly, then they need to think about what's going on. Certainly, poor investments are not going to go away if we just cut a dividend. If we can find some evidence that the firm is just not investing enough money, then maybe that is a reason to cut the dividend. But simply cutting the dividend doesn't make us invest any better. And in fact, if the firm doesn't have good projects available, then it probably should be paying out a dividend and eventually liquidating itself. Okay, so that is what we're going to be doing today. Calculating the free cash flow to equity, calculating what the firm actually paid out, calculating the firm's ROE and its ROC, and then comparing to the cost of equity and the cost of capital that you've already estimated for your firms. Okay, this isn't just another summary of what the firm should be doing, right? If we find that they're building up a cash surplus because their free cash flow to equity is always or generally greater than the dividend, but they have poor projects, they have an ROE that's less than the cost of equity, ROC that's less than the cost of capital, then they should be paying out more of that cash. We shouldn't trust them to keep our cash, and so they should be paying out more of it to stockholders. On the other hand, if they have that cash surplus but they have generally good projects and their ROE exceeds the cost of equity generally, then we probably will allow them some flexibility and maybe not put so much pressure on management yet to pay out a dividend. Then down here, if we've got a cash deficit because we're continually paying out more in dividends and repurchases than we generate in free cash flow, and we generally have poor projects, yeah, we should probably cut the dividends, but that's not going to help. That's not going to fix the investment problem, right? We need to do probably both of those things. On the other hand, if we have a cash deficit but we have good projects, then really we ought to be cutting the dividend if we already have one. Certainly not initiating a dividend if we haven't started one yet, and focus on reinvestment in the firm. So I had to pause for a moment, but let me get back to where we were. So, okay, we have said that when a firm does decrease the dividend, even if it's for a good reason, the market tends to react, right? And, well, maybe we're not ready for that slide yet. And why does the market tend to react in a negative fashion, I guess is what I should have said. Anytime a firm decreases the dividend, even if it's for a good reason, there tends to be a negative stock return, right? The stock price falls. Well, at a minimum, that's because if the firm is paying a dividend, then the people attracted to buy the stock are people who like dividends. And so some of those people will sell the stock initially when the firm cuts the dividend. And it will take some time before new investors come into the firm, the kind of firm that agree with what the firm has done and that are not really interested in a dividend anyway, perhaps, right? So we see this here. This is empirical evidence, 176 firms where a firm announced a dividend decrease at the same time that they announced a decrease in earnings. Another 208 firms in which firms announced a dividend decrease sometime after they had announced an earnings loss or a decline in earnings. And then another 16 firms, that's not a very large sample size there, but another 16 firms where they announced that they were cutting the dividend, but they also had some announcement of good news trying to explain probably why that they're cutting the dividend in order to put their money into investment or growth, right? Now, obviously, it's easy to say, oh, we've got great investment opportunities, or we're putting this money back into growth because we think we have good investment opportunities, right? It's easy to say, and investors will want to see some kind of tangible evidence of that maybe before they actually buy it. And so what happens? Well, in all these cases, on average, there was some kind of decrease in the stock price before the announcement of the dividend decrease. That's not surprising. But then when the dividend decrease was announced, what happened? For firms that had some kind of earnings decline or loss at the same time that is announced, that's where you get the most negative price reaction, right? At one and the same time, they're saying earnings have decreased and we're cutting the dividend. You see a little bit after, a little bit of a stock bump afterwards, because the market tends to overreact to good and bad news, so maybe this was a little bit of a reaction, so it corrects a little bit, right? But still, the overall net effect there is a negative return on bad news, right? Poor earnings and a decrease of dividend. Over here we have a firm that's already announced some of the bad news with regard to earnings. So now when they announce the next piece of bad news, there's some reaction. It's not as big, right? Because some of the reaction has already been built into the price. And then again, we see a little bit of an increase afterwards as the market comes back a little bit, and maybe investors who thought they should have decreased the dividend are coming to the firm now. And then finally we have a little bit of evidence. Again, n equals 16 is not a large sample size, and maybe these two numbers are not that different, but a little bit of evidence that announcing investment opportunities that you have as the reason for decreasing the dividend tends to soften the blow a little bit here. But then in the quarter after, when investors start to see tangible evidence maybe of those investment opportunities, and you get investors coming in who did not like dividends, and so now are coming to the firm because they're interested in the capital gains rather than dividend returns, then you see a nice bump here in the stock price. And this really kind of shows us that these firms are probably doing the right thing, right? If they truly do have investment opportunities that are good, and they don't have enough cash without cutting the dividend, then that's what they should be doing, is cutting the dividend and reinvesting, right? So we see that there. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is measure this free cash flow to equity. How much cash is left in the business after we've paid out everything that we have to pay out to keep the business going, to reinvest in the business as it is, right? Not necessarily, well, I guess in some cases growth opportunities, right? So we're reinvesting in the firm and paying whomever we have to pay, then what's left for our equity holders. So we start with our net income. That's cash flow into the business, but we know that there is one big non-cash expense on our income statement, and that's the combination of depreciation and amortization. So we add that back so that we're not just getting net earnings, right, the accounting number, but net cash flow. And cash is what we're interested in. So we get our cash flow from operations that are available to equity investors. But first we have to take out any dividends that we are committed to from our preferred stock, right? We can't pay a dividend to our common stockholders until we've paid our preferred stock dividends. We also have to make the necessary capital expenditures, right? These are asset purchases for new projects or asset purchases needed to maintain ongoing projects. And we need to subtract our working capital needs, right? That's the necessary investments in inventory and accounts receivable, right? After taking into account cash that's coming in from collecting accounts receivable and selling inventory. And then we need to take out principal repayments, right? In other words, any debt that we're paying the principal on, we take that out because we have to make those payments. And then we add, as cash coming in, any new debt that we've issued, right? And that the total of all of those things gives us our free cash flow to equity. So now let's go to our statements. To make that calculation. So here, notice down here I have Microsoft's statement of cash flow for 5 years down here. I also have the trailing 12 months at this point. When I pulled this data, we were in the beginning of 2013. So I'm using the most recent 10K that I had available to me at the time was 2012, so I'm using 2012 and the preceding 4 years of data, right? Use the most recent data that you have. Well, and I should say, I had you download the cash flow statement for your firm along with your income statement and your balance sheet at the beginning of the semester. So use that. There's no need to go back and get newer stuff. I mean, things change from year to year, but they always change from year to year. So this is still the most recent 5 years from the beginning of the semester is still a good approximation of what the firm can pay out and what it has been paying out. So now that we have, if you have your cash flow statement pasted in here, we're everything that we need for free cash flow to equity and for the cash paid out to stockholders in dividends and repurchases is on the cash flow statement. Then we're going to need our income statement and our balance sheet and some stock returns for some of the other things that we're going to look at, but we'll deal with those later. I mean, if you've pulled up your stuff from Mergent Online, you might as well paste these in. And you might pause here at this point to make sure you get your cash flow statement and your balance sheet in place. We have our data now, and we're going to calculate our free cash flow to equity. So I take my net income. And one thing that's great about the cash flow statement is that it's entered as cash flows. Positive numbers are cash flows into the firm, negative numbers are cash flows out of the firm, right? If you think about the typical income statement, everything's just entered as an absolute value number, and we're supposed to know that the cost of revenue, for example, is an expense, so that will be subtracted. We don't have to know anything about when we're looking at the cash flow statement. They do the work for us. So, so here you can see in this formula, I'm just adding everything. And I know that if it's an outflow, it will already be a negative. So I don't have to worry about that. So I have my net income, my depreciation, accounts receivable, inventory and accounts payable, and other working capital items. Right? I need all my working capital, my current assets other than cash, whether inflows or outflows, I add those. Then I come down to investing activities, and I add my investments in property, plant, and equipment, right? That's typically going to be a negative number because those are cash outflows. And my acquisitions, right? That an acquisition, especially for a firm like Microsoft, is a big way they grow, right? So it's a capital expenditure. Notice I'm not including this purchase of investments or sale of investments, right? That's not capital expenditures in assets. This is these are firms that have these big war chests or cash hoards. Don't need all that cash for operations, so they tend to invest it in short-term investments like buying the commercial paper of other firms, money market accounts, short-term treasury bills, right? Those kind of things, so that at least the money's not just sitting in a checking account earning nothing. It's earning something, but it's also very accessible if they need it, right? Because that's what they always claim. They're keeping it for that next great investment opportunity that we can't foresee. And then I'm also going to add debt issued, right? That would be bonds that the firm is selling, or bank debt that the firm is accessing, and also debt repayment. Notice that that's going to be a negative number, right? It will go in as a negative number, so I don't have to put in a negative. I'm still just adding everything. And so that takes care of my free cash flow to equity equation. Everything that's going in and out of the firm related to operations and investment. Then I can calculate the cash flow that the firm makes to stockholders. And so if I come down here, then here we can see we're talking about common stock issued. Now notice here, in this formula, I have a negative sign outside of the parentheses where I've added everything. So I've mentioned that this, on the cash flow statement, inflows are entered as positive numbers and outflows are entered as negative numbers. And that is from the point of view of the firm. So, right, when they issue common stock, money flows into the firm. When they repurchase common stock, money flows out of the firm. When they pay dividends, money flows out of the firm. So I've just added those in here. And so now just the sum of those would give us the net cash flow to the firm from issuing and repurchasing common stock and paying a dividend. But what I really want is, for this calculation, is from the point of view of the investor, and so that's why I have the negative here, right? If it's an outflow from the point of view of the firm, it's an inflow to the investor and vice versa. Okay, so that's that calculation. One thing you may find odd here, and I know I certainly did before I sat back and thought about it, was, this firm is in the same year issuing stock and repurchasing stock. That seems a little crazy, doesn't it? But what's actually going on here is Microsoft, of course, like many tech companies and growth firms, has an employee stock ownership program, and they do options to managers and stuff like that. So they do have to occasionally, well, in fact, every year they issue a little bit of stock, and that's just to fund those programs. Okay, so now we have our calculation. This is the free cash flow to equity, the cash available to pay a dividend or repurchase stock, and this is the actual cash used to repurchase stock or pay a dividend. I'm sorry, I probably shouldn't keep doing that back and forth. That's probably annoying. And so now we can calculate the cash returned ratio. Right, and this is, of course, what Damodaran likes better than the payout ratio, which is just the dividend divided by net income. Right, here we have the dividend plus the stock repurchase divided by the cash that's really available to be paid out. And so you can see in 2008 they paid out quite a bit more than they had. Right, remember 2008 was not such a good year. But they may have already had, they already had a dividend policy in place, so they didn't want to decrease that dividend, and they may have already committed to some stock repurchases, so they went ahead and did that. Or, as many firms will argue, if Microsoft's price had already fallen, and the management wants to prove, in quotation marks, to the market that their stock is worth more, they'll repurchase it, right? And they say, oh, it's such a bargain at this price, we know it's going to go up, and this is a really good way for us to use some of our excess cash right now is to invest in ourselves. And so, yeah, we see that they're doing that in good measure in 2008. Then in 2009, notice that what they pay out actually goes up a little bit, but now we've recovered our cash flow so much. Obviously, if you look at these years, 2008 was an anomaly. 2012 doesn't look so good either, but things are much better in between 2008 and 2012. But even though they increased the payout because their free cash flow to equity increased so much, their cash return ratio is actually below 1, and again even less. So again, both increased in 2010, but the payout ratio is less, and that same thing happens again in 2011. Right? So obviously, the cash that's coming into the firm, the cash flow into the firm, is increasing faster than the dividends and the repurchases are increasing. And then in this last year that I have, 2012, obviously we had another big decrease in the cash flow coming into the firm. And we can, if we're curious, we can look at that. Well, that was a dip in net income, a little bit of an increase in depreciation. Not really big changes here, but a big acquisition took place, right? So that may be, not maybe, that's certainly a big part of why the 2012 numbers don't look so good, right? Partially because of slightly lower net income, but much bigger acquisition than has happened since 2008. Okay, blah, blah, enough blathering. The important thing is that you make these calculations for yourself, for your own firm, and take a look at what's happening, right? If you do see big dips or big bumps, you might want to go through the calculations and see where that's happening. Because certainly a big increase in acquisitions is probably better news than a big drop in net income. Okay, so now I've got what the firm had available and what it paid out, and I have my cash returned ratio. And now I want to see how well they've been doing with their investments. So I'm going to gather several different things and then calculate some things, right? I'm going to gather my net income. That's, of course, from my income statement over here, B19. I'm going to get my total assets from the balance sheet. That's not total assets, that's total cash. Here's total assets. And I'm going to get total equity also from the balance sheet. Right? Not total liabilities and stockholder equity. Of course, that would be the same as total assets, but total equity. Take that back. Then I'm also going to calculate my operating income minus taxes. Right, so that's really like net income, but excluding interest expense, right? So I get both of those from my income statement. Now, if you remember from when we did the ratios, not everybody has operating income labeled nicely as operating income. You might have income from operations, you might have earnings before interest and taxes, or you might have had to calculate it yourself. But if I've thoroughly gone over your ratios, you have everything correct, and I've told you everything's correct, then you probably have operating income calculated somewhere if your firm doesn't already state it, because we needed operating income for times interest earned and cash coverage. Okay, so then I am also going to calculate invested capital, right? So what that is my total assets number minus the cash on my balance sheet. And here I'm using, for Microsoft, I would be using total cash, right? That's cash and cash equivalents plus short-term investments, right? So that's that excess cash that is not just sitting in a checking account, it's in money market accounts of some sort. But the important thing for my purposes is that this is money that's not invested right now in long-term assets or even working capital here. It's just sitting. So I might want to look at what they're earning on what they've invested Or I might want to look at what they're earning in total. Notice, of course, this number is bigger because it includes cash. And if I use this number as, the basis for what they should be earning a return on, then I'm saying, look, if they're going to sit on all this cash, they better be earning a return that justifies sitting on this cash. On the other hand, I might just look at this where I exclude the cash and just look at what is actually invested in current assets or fixed assets and say, what are they really earning on this invested capital? And so now I have my inputs. I can calculate all kinds of accounting returns, right? And let's remind ourselves that these are accounting returns, and all the things that we usually say about accounting numbers hold true here. This is past, not future. They're not market values, right? It's the book value of assets, whatever the hell that really is, right? Historical cost minus depreciation. So these are not perfect measures, but neither are stock returns, right? Because we know of, the vagaries of the market. So we're going to look at accounting measures of return, and we're also going to look at stock performance. And hopefully our firm is consistent, and then we don't have to make a choice. But if both accounting returns and stock returns tell us our firm's doing pretty well, then I think we can safely say, yeah, they're doing pretty well. If one says no and the other says yes, then we might have an issue to thinking about which answer to put greater weight on. Okay, blah, blah, blah. Let's get back to the calculation. So, of course, as you know, return on assets is net income over assets, right? If I use my cell references, I just drag everything across. Return on capital is operating income minus taxes, right? So we're excluding interest and just invested capital, right? So it's really, you can think of a return on capital as an adjusted ROA. First, we're adjusting for interest expense in the numerator, right? We're kind of ignoring that. And we're adjusting for cash in the denominator and saying we're not going to count that against them, right? So, of course, in both of these things are going to make the return on capital look higher than the return on assets because we've got higher well, that's funny. Why isn't it higher? It's actually lower, isn't it? Is there a mistake in my numbers? Let's see. What am I missing here? So here's operating income. Oh, look at that. In the case of Microsoft, at least for this year, they do have some other income that's not included here. So that bumps that up. And so, well, okay. So that's why. And they have some for every year except that one, 2009. So here, of course, in that case, we do see what I was expecting to see, that when we exclude interest expense, that operating income minus taxes is higher than net income. But every other year, it's actually lower just because they have that kind of significant amount of other income that gets thrown in there. So well, what should we do? Should we add back in that other income? No, we're not, because again, here we're looking for income from operations. That other income is likely to be from investments, perhaps, those short-term investments, maybe the interest that we're earning. So that's not a return on our operating assets. And here we are measuring the amount invested in our operating assets, right? So that makes sense. But anyway, particularly because we take out that big cash hoard, and notice there's a big difference because Microsoft does sit on a lot of cash between assets and assets minus cash. And so we do get a much higher return on capital, invested capital, than we do on assets. Okay, fine. And now we're going to calculate return on equity, net income over equity, right? Now, yeah, you've calculated return on assets and return on equity already for your financial ratio analysis, your financial statement analysis. But, given that it's such an easy calculation, I'm just having you do it again. Your cost of equity and your cost of capital would be coming from your cost of capital estimation that you've already done for your firm. So go ahead and find that stuff and plug that in here. And then, I've just compared them here. I mean, clearly we can see comparing cost of equity to return on equity, Microsoft is doing very well. Same is true when we look at cost of capital, right? Even when we're kind of using the most stringent measure where we're saying, if you're going to sit on all that cash, you better justify it. They're still, their return is much, much higher than their cost of capital. And just to, turn that into a number, I've computed the spread difference between them. So cost of capital versus return on capital, cost of equity versus return on equity. This measure is a little more generous than that measure, but still, we're still beating, in all the 5 past years, we're still beating our cost of capital. Okay, that's great. So far, from an accounting point of view, it looks like Microsoft is worthy of our trust in terms of holding on to our cash, right? Because cash that's on the balance sheet really belongs to the stockholders. But now let's take a look at returns. Look at the stock price measure of the kind of returns that we're earning. So what do? Well, I need to get stock price data. And you probably already have stock price data because I did ask you to gather stock price data in order to compute your PE ratio and your market to book ratio. But now you're going to need dividend data. And a good place to get actually both of those things in a very simple format is to go to Morningstar. So you know the drill. To get on Morningstar, you go through the Joiner Library, you sign in if you're not already on campus, using an on-campus computer. You go to Morningstar, look up your firm, and here, once you get to your firm's page, here I'm looking at performance. Now, if you need your price history, if you didn't lift it from your from what you already have, you can come over here and you want yearly, right? Because you only need one stock price per year to compute annual returns, and you want 5 years. Okay, and so now you can just type these in right into your Excel spreadsheet. But if you're lazy like me, excuse me, you could export it, and you'll get this little CSV file. And why isn't it not letting me open? Because it's already over here. And what am I doing, right? Because I'm actually probably putting myself to more trouble than if I just type these in, but I want these, the way I've put things in is I want these across with 2008 first. So I'm first going to have to sort my data, sort it A to Z. Didn't like that. I need to block this, right? Now I'm going to sort A to Z. And so I get 2008 first, and then I'm going to take my closing prices, copy them, and go over to my spreadsheet that I'm looking for. And what I'm going to do is, of course, I pasted them in already. I put them here, and I go to Home, and I'm going to use transpose, right? And it puts them in there for me. I probably could have done it faster just by typing it in, but I hate to type stuff when I can block and copy. But now I need my dividends. So I go back to Morningstar, I hit dividends and splits, and that's going to give it to me in a couple different ways, right? I'm going to get a graph, and I'm going to get a table, so I can just block that data right there if I do it properly, and my mouse doesn't shift. Come on. Yeah, see, again, I probably could have done this faster. And copy, and bring it over to Excel, and paste with match destination formatting, and I get it nicely there, right? So it's already up here. So I have my price per year and my dividend per year. Now you could go back and forth about which day should I be taking the price from, and should I have an average price for the year or over 5 days or something like that, blah, 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 right? Yes, whatever choice you make will change the results that you get. But on average, how big will the results be? They shouldn't be all that big, right? So I've taken the prices that they gave me as they gave me. Of course, I think if we looked here, those prices, right, they were fairly consistent, and these are, since I happen to be doing this on the 4th of November, I have closing prices from November 1st, and then, oh, well, that's, hold on. It went back to 5 day for 5 year. So it gave me year-end prices for every year except this year. It gave me the most recent closing price for this year. And, you know, since we're almost to December, I'm not going to quibble too much about that. I could ignore 2013 if I want to, but when I look at what's going on with Microsoft, the 2013 number looks pretty good compared to 2012 already. So I'm going to go ahead and use it. And then I'm going to calculate returns, right? So here in row 5 is my total return. If you remember way back from 3724, to get the total return, you take the price that you, so we're thinking about, let's say we had purchased this stock at the beginning of 2009, right, which is the end of 2008. So we purchased at the end of 2008 and we're selling at the end of 2009. And in 2009, so that's when we own the stock for that year, we would have gotten 52 cents total in dividends. So we have the selling price plus the dividend minus the buying price, all in parentheses in the numerator, divided by the buying price. And that gives me my total return on the stock. Right? I dragged that across, and then I just took the average. Right? It's an arithmetic average of annual total return. Then I'm also going to calculate my dividend yield here. Just want to break that out. And of course, the dividend yield is the dividend divided by the price. Right, this is the, maybe not exactly the right way to do it, right, because this is the dividend that I got for the year 2008, but this is the price at the end of 2008. So if I want to be a purist, I guess I could come over here and say, okay, if I purchased it if I got this dividend in 2009, all of it, then maybe I purchased it at the end of 2008, so I could do this. Right? That cuts down on the data that I have, though, because I'm using, from a year before. And if I do that and take the average, I'm just copying and pasting the formula, then it's a little bit higher. Right, a little bit higher, but not such a big deal. Okay, so I have my total return, my average arithmetic total return, right, annual. I have my average dividend yield calculated kind of two ways. And then here I also want to calculate a geometric annualized return, right? So I'm calculating the annual rate of return. I use my rate function, and well, I'll go ahead and pull it up so you can see what it looks like. Right? If you don't have rate already on Excel as one of your options, if you haven't done your 3724 homework, for example, using Excel, you're going to just have to search for rate. And we've got 5 periods, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm thinking about buying at the end of 2008 and selling at the end of 2013. So my present value, I put in negative the price from 2008. My future value, I put in the price from 2013 and press enter, and I get an annualized return of 12.82%. Okay, so now this, of course, is just from the capital gain, so that's why I calculated my dividend yield. If I, think about the average dividend yield, I mean, there's not really a great way to put that in unless I want to do a lot more complicated math, because, my dividend's not constant. And if it had been a constant dividend throughout that period, I could have included the dividend as my payment, right? But it's not constant, so I'm not going to include it. But on average, I'm getting a little more than 2% from the dividend every year. So whether I want to look at a geometric return and say, well, almost 13% plus about 2% is about 15% return per year, or I look at my average return, an arithmetic average, about 18% per year. Again, luckily for me, as the analyst, all this stuff is much better than Microsoft's cost of equity and cost of capital. So all the way around, from accounting returns, no matter how I calculate my accounting return, to stock performance, no matter how I calculate my stock return and my dividend yield, everything's telling me that Microsoft is doing a pretty good job with the cash that it's holding, and it is returning, a good portion of that cash to the stockholders. So I think I probably at this point would say, keep doing what you've been doing. We see that they have been increasing the actual dividend and, well, maybe not increasing the repurchases, but there's been, a good portion of money paid out in the form of repurchases as well. I hate those kind of, I almost said decent, I really hate that word in a formal report. A decent amount of repurchases paid out. I mean, what does that even mean? But really, when you compare, you can see that in the first few years, they were paying out much more in repurchases than in dividends. And then in these last 2 years, it's a little bit more in dividend, less in repurchase, but nearly equal, right? So they seem to be continuing both, maybe making more of that payout permanent and less of it discretionary in the form of repurchases. And we should, we would probably expect to see the repurchase number fluctuate more, more of a as needed or as available cash payout versus the more steady dividend payout. Okay, so I could probably blather forever, you know how I am, but as the analyst, I'm going to say to Microsoft, you seem to know what you're doing with dividend policy. Keep doing it. Microsoft is increasing the dividend every year, it looks like, so they might as well just keep on that path. And I'll say goodbye. Thanks.